Welcome to Women's Leadership Today. We're your hosts, Michelle Myers.
And I'm Nikolette. We're bringing you the latest in leadership development and expertise. Every month we have a theme here at Women's Leadership Today, and September's theme is influence. Michelle, you had provided this great definition of influence for the newsletter this month, and I'm just going to read that out because it was really, really good. You said,
Sure.
influence is about motivating and inspiring others to take action. What you do, say, and how you present yourself leaves a lasting impression. And I think that really captures just how important influence is.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm really glad that that spoke to you. Influence is certainly a skill that often gets overlooked, and one that many people don't really think about when looking at what skills they need in their personal toolkit. But it really is such an important skill to develop, and it's especially important in the workplace. Because when you're on a team or working on a project and need help and input from your peers, but these are people that you don't have direct authority over. You're not their manager or the direct supervisor. You're really asking them to give up their time and their resources, but you don't have that direct authority to, in a sense, command them to do so. So that's where influence really comes into play, is getting that buy-in,
Mhm.
getting that support, and being able to persuade others to give you a hand.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a great workshop just recently, led by Audrey Halpern, Leading Without Authority, which talks about just this, right? How if
Yeah.
you're not the official leader, right? If you're not the manager, and we've talked a lot about how you can certainly be a leader without being a manager, but if you don't
Hmm.
have that, you know, given authority right off the bat, how you can still cause influence at work, how you can still influence those around you, even if you don't have that given authority. And I think it was a really excellent workshop. Um, influence, one of the things I learned is that influence isn't about giving orders, right? Because
Hmm.
influence is kind of this like vague word, and it kind of gets mixed up with other things like charisma, giving orders, persuasion is another one it gets mixed up with a lot.
Yeah, persuasion is
Yeah,
a
and I
big part
think
of it.
that it's one of the things I learned from the workshop was that it's not really about giving orders. It's about trust, it's about credibility, and it's about, like you said, getting buy-in from the people
Hmm.
around you. And you can certainly have influence in all different directions. The difference here is that, especially since influence and persuasion get mixed up so much, I think one of the interesting things Audrey said is that the difference between influence and persuasion specifically is that persuasion is a conscious act, where you're trying to alter the behavior of someone specifically, whereas influence can be conscious or unconscious and is really about building that foundation of trust, credibility, getting that buy-in, and then kind of using that to then be able to influence not only the behavior but the situation as well. That's another great thing she said, that you can influence both behavior, people, and the situation. It was just really cool.
Yeah, I really did like the way she broke up the difference between influence and persuasion. And I think you're right. Persuasion is definitely more of a conscious act, something that we think about, where influence is, it can be a conscious act, and you can put effort to develop that skill for sure. But over time, it becomes more natural. It's something that we work on and can develop. And like you said, it's working on building trust with people, making those connections.
Exactly. Another awesome thing that she had talked about, that I've seen, is that once in a while in workplaces, um, sometimes men have an automatic influence because of, society and the way that we
Mhm.
view things, there's this unconscious buy-in that sometimes gives males in the workplace a an automatic influence and automatic power, whereas females sometimes have to work a little bit harder at that. We have to actually build that influence skill because we don't come in with that automatic influence. Sometimes we have to build that out and work on that, which I thought was really interesting as well. And I have seen that in some workplaces. I will say that I've worked also in places that are, um, and with people who are very influential. It seems very natural to them, who are women. And
Mhm.
then, but I've also worked in industries, specifically in factories with a very like heavy male coworker population. And I do notice that it
Okay.
seems like the females in those situations do have to work a little harder to have that same level of influence. I don't know if you've seen this as well, Michelle.
I think so. And honestly, I think in most places where I've worked, I've had more male colleagues than female colleagues. And so when I have had a female colleague that can really command the room, people sit up and listen, it really stands out. You really definitely notice that. And it's very impressive. It's a very impressive skill to have.
Yeah, definitely. Ha- is there someone specifically in mind you can think of who's like had a lot of influence where you've worked?
Definitely. When I think of someone who's influenced me, I think of this woman, Brenda Bailey. When I was in college, I worked part time for a CPA firm or partnership. I was in office with two women, and Brenda was the more senior of the two partners. And so this was really my first office type job. I was in college working on my business degree, and Brenda really showed me how to run a business, but also what good work ethic looked like, but also the importance of balancing work with their personal life. And I didn't really appreciate that as much at the time as I do now, but that's such an important component. And plus, we became very good friends, and I really looked at her as a sort of mentor. And the things I learned from her and the things she would say to me, I still think of to this day. And sometimes I sort of even use that as a barometer. You know, how would Brenda have reacted to this? What would if she has said, you know, what would she have said about this? Well, how about you, Nicola? Who is someone that's influenced you?
Yeah, well, so I when I worked at Seduxo and I was doing marketing for Seduxo out in South Dakota, I worked closely with two people who I would consider had the same level of influence, especially over me. And they were very, very different, which I think is really interesting. So the first, she was the
Mhm.
executive chief of catering, and this woman was she commanded a room. As soon as she walked into a room, even if you didn't see her, everyone knew she had arrived, right? Which is how I always thought of influence. That's the people who command the room, the people who have a lot of charisma, the people who have a lot of power. Um, and it was really interesting because she did have a lot of influence. Everyone listened to what she said, certainly. Um, but the way she had influence was really a little bit intimidating.
Mhm.
It was a little bit like she kind of ran things kind of like a drill sergeant, which was very effective. And it certainly, like I said, everybody had a lot of respect for her and certainly did what she said. And then the other person, the executive chef, he was, I would say, had the same amount of influence, but he was a lot different. Really had, he built those relationships, right? He knew his employees really well. He was a fun boss, I would say, which you don't get a whole lot of, or at least I haven't had a whole lot of. So it was always a good time. But I think what really made his influence stand out is not only his credibility, right? I go back to what Audrey said about trust and credibility. And he exuded both trust and credibility because he knew what he was doing, right? He had plenty of years of
Mhm.
experience in different areas in obviously cooking, but in also running a kitchen, in running events. So he had a lot of credibility, a lot of experience, but because he formed those relationships with the employees, he was always back with us, um, having a good time, getting to know us all the time. It formed that level of trust. So I think that's really interesting because it's two different ways that influence really kind of works there, right? You have the
That's
more
right.
leadership based influence, right? That leadership credibility, I'm in charge, so we're going to do what I say, right? And then you have the more like with chef, I really wanted to do what he said because I liked him, and he seemed to like me a lot, right? So I think that's really interesting that in that specific workplace I got both of those dynamics and those two strong personalities, and I learned a little bit from each of them too. So that was really really cool.
Well, and I think those are two really great examples that you shared, because the first one, like you said, she commanded the room, and we were when you were describing this, it makes me think of Meryl Streep in A Devil Wears Prada, her walking
Yes.
and everyone's screaming. That's the exact came to mind. That's how she was like. But that kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where she obviously had the authority and commanded it, and kudos to her. That's great that she was able to own that room and and fill that space. But again, that's not something that most of us can relate to. I think most
Yeah.
of us can relate more to the chef, where he, while it sounds like he did still have a role of authority and management over people from his position, the way he went about influence was different and more subtle, and probably more a little bit more realistic to what most of us can do. It's making those connections, forming those bonds. And of course, we don't have to be best friends with everyone that we
Yeah.
work with, and we can't do that, but we can certainly build that credibility, show that respect, and garner that respect from our peers. And those are really so foundational to creating influence.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that, you know, being best friends with everyone and having everyone's respect is two different things. And I know sometimes I fall into
Hmm.
the pitfall of, getting those mixed up, or, wanting to be best friends with everyone and then getting upset if like something's not working out specifically, or if we're not communicating well. But there's a big difference between being best friends and just being friendly all the time and having that respect. And especially when it comes to influence, I think that respect is key. And Michelle, I'm going to flip that around. We talked
Okay.
about who's influenced us. I want to know, who have you influenced specifically?
Oh, who have I influenced? Um, that's definitely a tough one. When we were talking about this topic for today's episode, I was thinking about this, and it is a tough question. I have managed employees, and I like to think that I've influenced them. But then I was also thinking about what I do outside of work. And I've been a Girl Scout troop leader for 9 years. And one of the key goals of Girl Scouts is to develop leadership skills in young women and help them become active members of their communities. So I like to think that I've influenced the girls and the young women I've had the privilege of leading in our troop, and that really means a lot to me, because one, it's just something I enjoy doing, but to think of having that influence, having that impact on the next generation really means quite a bit. That's something really special for me. Okay, Nicolette, your turn.
That's awesome.
Who is someone that you've influenced, you think?
Yes, so I have never been a manager specifically. I will admit, after having these conversations, that I have been a leader, but I've never been managing a team of people before. So I also kind of have to think about what I do outside of work. And one of the things I do is I teach dog training classes. And any teacher will know, and I'm not comparing myself to a teacher of children. I know it's very different, but any kind of teacher, instructor will know that you need to have a lot of influence to make an impact in a class. It's the
Hmm.
same as Girl Scouts, right? You're teaching lessons, you're instilling knowledge, so you have to have influence to make that stick. If I had no influence, my first of all, I would never make any sales. Nobody would ever recommend me. And second, the lessons wouldn't stick. It wouldn't make a difference to my students. And I think the training classes are such a unique example, or any really instructional course, if you run any kind of instructional course, because you get to see firsthand almost right away if your influence is
Hmm.
effective, right?
Yeah.
Because you see the difference night and day between, because it's not me training those dogs, it's me training the people to train their dogs, right? So if they come back the next week and the lesson's stuck and the dog's doing better and they seem happier and more bonded, I know for a fact that the way I'm teaching the lesson is sticking that influence, right? Um, and I do take some of those lessons too. I try to build that trust and credibility, get to know everyone, get to know their dogs. Um, and it's really interesting because if most of my class comes back and nobody's practiced, then I know I have to not only change the method I'm using, but also my teaching
Hmm.
style, because that actually I found is more important than the method I'm actually using is how I'm getting the information across, how I'm influencing the students. So I think that that's a really interesting way to look at it. And when we had been talking about this question, I really like patted myself on the back and I was like, good for you. You are a good influencer for sure.
Absolutely. And you're having to make those connections and build that trust with your clients, especially the first time they come to you. They don't typically, I'm sure, know you. So you have to lay that groundwork. You have to build that trust, that credibility, make them comfortable and feel confident that you have the tools and the skill set to teach them to teach their dog. And sometimes we call that sort of train the trainer, in the business world. And
Yes.
that's definitely something that you're having to do. So I think that's a great example of influence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do like to because I think that you'll get a similar experience when you use influence at work, when you practice this influence at work, is it's really important to be self-aware, and to recognize when you need more practice,
Hmm.
when something's not working. So I think being an instructor gives a really interesting perspective on self-awareness because you do have that week to week, you can see the difference. So, but I think like if you're using the skill at work, I think that this is something you can evaluate as well. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. It's like any skill. It's something you need to practice, you need to refine, you need to see what works and what doesn't. And if it's not working, that's fine. Then you need to adjust it. And I remember
Hmm.
that Audrey described in her workshop, Leading Without Authority, the five influence styles. And do you want to sort of walk us through those, Nicolette?
Yeah, absolutely. I love these. I've been working with these for the last week, and I'm just obsessed. So first we have rationalizing. So rationalizing involves using facts and logic to back up your ideas and goals. Asserting, which involves insisting your ideas are heard and challenging the ideas of others. Negotiating, this one's about spending the time to find win-win solutions, or at least as close as you can get. Inspiring, which involves encouraging and motivating the people around you. And then bridging, which is about connecting with others and that collaboration, building those relationships and that trust that we were talking about. So those are the five. Michelle, out of those, what do you think is your strongest influencing style?
Yeah, when looking at these and thinking about that, I couldn't really put myself into just one of those five categories, and I'm sure that'll be typical for most people.
Yeah.
But I would say a mix of rationalizing, because I do tend to use logic and data when trying to get
Mhm.
support for ideas or projects or get justification. This is why I'm asking you to do this. This is why I need this resource, this budget, your time. Here's the reason.
Yeah.
Here's the data, the facts to back that up. But also bridging for sure. Because to me, making connections with others is such a big piece of having influence. So we've definitely been talking about that all along the way. Plus, making those connections
Hmm.
and collaborating is really what I enjoy most when working with a team or working for people on that project. To me, those connections are fundamental. One, it's such an important part of influence, but then also for me, that's part of that task that I enjoy is working with someone, putting our heads together, and making that outcome happen. Well, I'm going to turn that back to you, Nicolette. How about you? Which style or styles do you identify with most?
Yeah, absolutely. Just real quick before I go into what I think about me, I think it was really interesting what you said, how it's hard to fit yourself into one of those styles. And that's another thing that was touched on in the workshop as well, is that you will eventually have to use all five styles. It's not like just because you're considering yourself, an inspirer doesn't mean that that's the only influence style you're ever going to use. And you're going to have strengths and weaknesses. It's interesting you said that you relate best to the rationalizer and also a little bit of the bridger.
Mm-hmm.
And bridging for me is actually I would consider my weakest style, and it always has been my whole life. I sometimes have trouble making those personal connections, especially at work because I've worked in restaurants, because I've worked in factories where the goal is to really come in, punch in, get your work done, punch
Mm-hmm.
out, go
Yeah,
home.
me too.
Um, Especially when I was working at Amazon, you're at your own station
Oh,
and
really?
nobody's around you all day.
Oh,
So yeah, so it's a little bit harder to make those connections and bridge. So
sounds lonely.
I not only did I struggle with it my whole life, not only did I struggle with it, but then on top of that, I didn't have to practice it for a lot of my working career. So I will say that bridging is certainly my weakest one. But that's really great that we're on the same team because we can kind of balance each other, which is awesome. And you're going to find on your teams at work as well that you're going to have people who have strengths and weaknesses in all different areas. That's the best kind of team to have, is a team with mixed strengths and weaknesses, because you can really build yourself up.
You mentioned a few moments ago that everyone's going to fall into different categories, and you might need to use these different styles at different times. And what I was going to say is, I think you also need to use different styles with different people. You need to know your audience. You need to know who you're trying to
Yes,
influence,
absolutely.
because for some, rationalizing is going to work. They just want to hear the facts, the data, the why, what, when, how of it. Some people you might need to use a little bit more asserting with, and then others, negotiating and sparring or
Yeah.
bridging is going to help you connect with them better. So I think people just need to be aware that you might have one style that you fall into, one category you fall into the most, or a mix of a couple. But then also you need to be aware of what style works best with those you're trying to collaborate with, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a perfect point. And again, why you're going to need all five of these styles eventually, because not only are you going to eventually use them yourself, but other people are going to be using these styles not against you. That's kind of like a weird hard word, but other people are going to be using these styles around you as well. And it's important to notice what style people prefer, because when you are then trying to influence their decisions or their behavior as well, you mirroring a person's
Mhm.
influence style can make a huge difference. So practicing all five of these styles is really the best way to go. And I think that for me specifically, I would think my strength would be negotiating. Even though I don't typically tend to build those strong relationship connections, I feel like I'm empathetic. I have a lot of emotional intelligence, and I'm particularly strong at uh, listening to what the other person is saying and trying to find that win-win. I find that I stumble upon that a lot, that win-win situation, because I have a really good sense of combining and compromising my needs and goals with the goals of others. So that's what I would say. I would say that I'm strong in negotiating, probably weakest in
But
bridging.
that's great. That's great that you can identify both those strengths and those weaknesses. That's something that we all need to take a look at so we can focus on those different areas. But these 5 influence styles was definitely one of my favorite takeaways from our recent workshop. I think they really give us all something to work with, like what we're saying, whether we are looking at what trait we relate to the most, or we're looking at which of these different styles will work best with the person whom we are trying to have that influence over.
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually have a little quiz coming out to go along with one of our articles that's coming out soon. So I will go ahead and put the link to that quiz in the show notes in the description. I don't know about you, Michelle, but I would love to see how many of our listeners fall into these 5 types for sure.
Absolutely, and I'll let you know, Nicolette. I did the quiz, and I was surprised. It actually said I was an asserter, which I was kind of surprised about. That was very interesting. How about you? Did you do the quiz, and what was your result?
Yes, I did get negotiator, so
Oh, there you
I
go.
fell a little more in line. And I know our coworker Henry took it as well, and he fell into negotiator as well, which I was surprised. I thought he'd be an inspirer for sure.
But like we said, you'll definitely have your one foot in a couple of different of those different styles for sure.
Absolutely. And if you do take the quiz, definitely drop in the comments what you got. We want to hear from you. Um, Michelle, we are going to wrap this up. We've been talking a
Mhm.
little longer than usual, so we give the audience a little more than they bargained for today, but that's perfectly fine. I think today's conversation was phenomenal. I really love this topic, influence. Um, just so everyone knows, we release 2 episodes every month. You're not going to want to miss a single one. You can watch us now on YouTube. You can also listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, almost anywhere podcasts can be found at this point. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and follow along with us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and now on Instagram as well. Thank you, Michelle.
All right. Thank you, Nicolette. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We look forward to seeing your comments.
Thank you for listening. Progressive Women's Leadership is passionate about providing the best tools to help you reach your fullest potential. Visit us today at progressivewomensleadership.com for access to workshops, articles, e-guides, and much more to help you further develop your skills and advance your career.